The sound wasn't a knock. It was a detonation. The crack of splintering pine and the shriek of tortured metal tore David from the deepest trench of sleep. For a disoriented second, he was back in the dust-choked haze of Kandahar, the air thick with the copper tang of fear. But this wasn't the desert. This was his sanctuary, the quiet cul-de-sac in Northwood Pines he'd chosen specifically because nothing ever happened here. His bedroom door shuddered as a heavy weight slammed against it from the hallway. A man's voice, artificially deep and trying for authority, boomed through the wood. "HOA security! Open up! We have an eviction order!" David's blood ran cold. Eviction? At 3 in the morning? It was insane. It was illegal. It was Carol Ann Weatherby's final psychotic move. Before his feet even hit the cool hardwood floor, another sound sliced through the night. A sharp pneumatic thwump followed by a wet splatter and a scream so high and panicked it could have shattered glass. David flung his door open to a scene from a fever dream. Standing in his hallway was a beefy figure in a cheap polyester security uniform, clawing at his face. His tactical vest was a prop. The badge on his chest looked like it came from a cereal box, and his eyes were squeezed shut as thick, fluorescent orange gel dripped from his cheeks. At the far end of the hall stood his 12-year-old son, Leo, holding his paintball rifle in a perfect two-handed stance, just as he'd been taught. The air was suddenly thick with the searing, acidic stench of capsaicin. In the distance, the faint wail of real police sirens began to rise. "Where are you watching from? Comment your city. I want to see how far this kind of HOA power reaches." T. Had all started 6 months earlier with the color beige. Not even a color, really. An absence of one. David had moved to Northwood Pines seeking that same absence of drama. After his wife Sarah lost her battle, the city felt too loud, its memories too sharp. He and Leo needed quiet. They needed the scent of pine needles after a summer rain and the low hum of cicadas in the July heat, not the constant grind of traffic and sirens. He'd traded his career as an Army intelligence analyst for a quiet life as a freelance data consultant, a life lived on his own terms. Their small ranch house, backed by a thick stand of Georgia pines, was supposed to be their fortress of solitude. The first letter arrived folded, not in an envelope, placed right under his doormat as if to imply they could have just walked in. It was from the Northwood Pines Homeowners Association. The letterhead was ostentatious, embossed with a pine cone crest that looked more like a medieval weapon. The subject line read, "Violation Notice, Section 4, Paragraph 2A, Aesthetic Uniformity." He'd scanned the text, his coffee growing cold in his hand. His mailbox, a standard-issue black metal box on a wooden post, was apparently painted in a shade of black that was inconsistent with the pre-approved community palette. The approved black, the letter clarified, was Sherwin-Williams tricorn black satin finish. His was presumably some rogue outlaw black. A fine of $50 was attached. If you've ever been bullied by an HOA, you're going to love this ending. Stick with me. David, a man trained to see patterns in chaos, saw this not as a request, but as an opening salvo, a range-finding shot. He drove to the hardware store, the smell of sawdust and fertilizer a welcome antidote to the sterile scent of the violation notice. He bought the ridiculously specific paint and spent a Saturday afternoon giving the mailbox a fresh coat. As he worked, a pristine silver Lexus SUV crawled past his house, slowing to an almost comical crawl. Behind the wheel was a woman with a helmet of perfectly coiffed blonde hair and sunglasses the size of dinner plates. She held an iPad up, and he heard the distinct click of its camera. This, he would soon learn, was Carol Ann Weatherby, the 60-something HOA president and self-appointed queen of Northwood Pines. Carol Ann ruled the neighborhood not with an iron fist, but with a clipboard and a labyrinthine set of covenants, conditions, and restrictions. She was a master of the passive-aggressive email and the public shaming post on the community Facebook page. Her husband was a county commissioner, a fact she dropped into conversation with the subtlety of a dropped anvil, which gave her petty tyranny the veneer of untouchable authority. The mailbox was just the beginning. A week later, another folded notice appeared. This one concerned the small vegetable garden that ran along the back of his house. It was Sarah's garden. Before, she got sick. Her hands were always in that dirt. Now, tending it was a ritual for David and Leo. It was their connection to her, a living, breathing memorial of heirloom tomatoes and unruly zucchini vines. The scent of tomato leaves on a hot afternoon was the smell of her memory. The snap of a fresh green bean tasted of a happier time. According to Carol Ann, the garden was now a violation. It was unstructured and visible from the walking path behind their property, which apparently disturbed the serene woodland aesthetic. This wasn't about paint anymore. This was a desecration. David decided to attend the next HOA meeting. It was held in the chilly, soulless community clubhouse, the air thick with the smell of industrial carpet cleaner and stale coffee. About a dozen residents were scattered in folding chairs, most looking either bored or cowed. Carol Ann sat at a long table at the front, flanked by two other board members who nodded at her every word like dashboard bobbleheads. David waited his turn. When he spoke, his voice was calm, measured. He explained the garden's significance. He pointed out it was healthy, contained, and harming no one. Carol Ann listened with a tight reptilian smile. "David," she said, her voice dripping with condescending pity. "We all have our sentiments, but the rules are the rules. They protect our property values." She tapped a thick binder on the table. "It's all in the covenants. Perhaps you should have read them more closely. Before you bought, that night David declared war, not with threats or anger, but with his old skill set, reconnaissance. He downloaded the Northwood Pines HOA covenants, a 128-page document of pure weaponized legalese. For 2 nights, fueled by black coffee, he treated it like an enemy document, searching for weaknesses, loopholes, and contradictions. He cross-referenced amendments, checked county records online, and mapped out the timeline of every rule change. And then he found it, buried in a footnote on page 78. The bylaws contained a grandfather clause. It stipulated that any aesthetic rule change could not be retroactively applied to landscaping, structures, or fixtures that were installed or established prior to the date of the amendment. The rule about structured gardens had been added by Carol Ann's board in 2019. He pulled up the satellite view from Google Earth, cycling back through the years. There it was, clear as day in the 2017 imagery, Sarah's garden, already thriving. He had his ammunition. At the following meeting, he didn't plead. He presented. He laid out the dated satellite photos, the text of the grandfather clause, and the date of the amendment. He spoke with the cold, irrefutable clarity of an analyst briefing a general. The air in the clubhouse grew thick and silent. Carol Ann's smile vanished, replaced by a pale, tight-lipped fury. She was a bully, and bullies operate on intimidation and bluff. When confronted with hard data, they crumble. She mumbled something about needing to confer with the board's legal counsel and quickly moved to the next agenda item. David had won the battle, but he'd just handed Carol Ann a reason to escalate the war. He felt a grim satisfaction, but also a knot of dread in his stomach. He had publicly exposed her lack of diligence, her overreach. A person like that doesn't just let it go. This wasn't just my fight anymore. It felt like it was for everyone who'd ever been pushed around. Tell me if your HOA has ever crossed the line. The retaliation was swift and suffocating. Carol Ann couldn't touch the garden, so she started carpet bombing him with other violations. His basketball hoop, which had been in the same spot for months, was suddenly 3 inches too close to the easement. Fine. $100. His trash receptacle was allegedly left at the curb for 20 minutes past the 8 p.m. deadline on collection day. Fine. $75. A single blade of grass in the sidewalk crack. A patch of moss on a north-facing brick. Each violation arrived on the same stiff, folded paper, delivered by Carol Ann herself, her silver Lexus idling at his curb like a predator waiting for a sign of weakness. The smell of her cloying, rose-scented perfume would linger by his front door for an hour after she left. She was turning his sanctuary into a prison yard, and he was the sole inmate. Neighbors started to grow distant. Carol Ann was spinning her narrative in the community Facebook group, painting him as a hostile, non-compliant resident who was intentionally driving down property values. He saw the sideways glances when he checked his mail, the hurried waves that didn't quite meet his eyes. What would you have done in my place? Drop it in the comments. The psychological operation was in full swing. David knew the objective: to isolate and demoralize the target until they surrender. But he wasn't a civilian target. He'd been trained to withstand this kind of pressure. He documented everything. He took time-stamped photos of his trash cans, measured the distance of the basketball hoop himself, and paid every bogus fine, with a check on which he wrote, "Paid under protest," in the memo line. He was building a case file, a dossier on Carol Ann Weatherby. Then, she escalated from paper to personnel. At the start of summer, an email announced that due to a rise in reported neighborhood concerns, the HOA had contracted a private security service for evening patrols. The company was called Patriot Enforcement Services. A quick search revealed it wasn't a company at all. It was a single LLC registered to a Gary Lutz, whose address traced back to Carol Ann's own sprawling property. It was her nephew. Gary was a caricature of authority. He drove a decommissioned Ford Crown Victoria he'd bought at a police auction, complete with a dented push bar and a cheap amber light bar he'd bolted to the roof. He was in his late 20s, with a soft jawline and the kind of simmering resentment common to men who'd failed the police academy entrance exam. He wore a uniform that was 2 sizes too tight and mirrored sunglasses, even at 10 o'clock at night. His patrols consisted almost exclusively of harassing David. He'd park across the street from David's house, the retired cruiser's engine rumbling in the quiet night. He'd sit there for an hour, engine idling, making a show of writing in a small notepad. He began shining his high-powered spotlight into David's windows, sweeping it across the living room, then lingering. On Leo's bedroom, that was the line. The absolute, uncrossable line. Threatening a man's home is one thing. Threatening his child's sense of security is another. David's training shifted from passive intelligence gathering to active countermeasures. The next weekend, he installed a professional-grade security camera system, the kind with night vision and motion alerts that pinged directly to his phone. He replaced the standard screws in his door jambs with 3-inch hardened steel screws, reinforcing the frame. He sat Leo down and they had a serious talk, not just about stranger danger, but about tactics. They reviewed the fire escape plan. They refreshed the rules on the paintball rifle, a high-end marker that could be loaded with solid nylon balls or, for more serious situations, pepper gel rounds. It was a deterrent, a last resort. Leo, who had a marksman's eye, understood. Completely, the pressure kept building. A low, constant hum of anxiety settled over the house. The scent of pine and cut grass was replaced by a sense of being watched. Leo stopped riding his bike around the cul-de-sac. Their fortress was under siege. David knew Carol Ann was trying to provoke a reaction, something she could use against him. An angry outburst, a public confrontation. He refused to give it to her. He continued his work, logged every incident, and waited for her to make a critical error. The error arrived via certified mail on a Tuesday afternoon. The letter was thick with self-importance. It was a formal notice from the HOA board, citing his ongoing pattern of willful non-compliance and deliberately hostile behavior toward board members and contractors. They had held an emergency executive session. The board had voted unanimously to levy a special conduct assessment against his property. The amount was staggering, $5,000, for legal consultation fees, additional security costs, and administrative burdens. It was illegal, a complete fabrication of HOA authority. But it was also terrifyingly real. The final paragraph was the kill shot. If the assessment was not paid in full within 72 hours, the HOA would place a lien on his property and immediately initiate foreclosure proceedings. It was a checkmate. A desperate, illegal, but powerful move. She wasn't trying to fine him. She was trying to take his home. She had finally overplayed her hand, moving from petty harassment to grand larceny. He stared at the letter, the crisp paper trembling slightly in his hand. He could fight it in court, but that would take months, maybe years, and thousands in legal fees he didn't have. She had him pinned. He felt the walls of his sanctuary closing in. He looked at a picture of Sarah on the mantelpiece, her smile bright and defiant. Surrender was not an option. That night, the air was still and heavy, the cicadas buzzing in a frantic, feverish rhythm. David couldn't sleep. He sat in the dark, the foreclosure letter on the table beside him, a plan beginning to form in his mind. He would call a lawyer first thing in the morning. He would contact the local news. He would expose her. He was mapping out the first steps of his counteroffensive when the front door exploded inward, and he found himself staring down a fake cop in a real-life nightmare. The sirens were getting closer now, their wails cutting through the stunned silence of his hallway. Gary, the security, was on his knees, gasping and sputtering, his face a grotesque mask of orange goo and tears. David stood over him, the cold realization dawning. Carol Ann's war for his property had just become a fight for his freedom, and it was a fight she had no idea he was trained to win. The flashing lights, red and blue, slashed through the darkness, painting the walls of David's hallway in chaotic strokes of electric color. The air, already sharp with the chemical burn of pepper gel, was now thick with the scent of night air and the low thrum of idling engines. Two uniformed officers stood in the fractured doorway, their expressions a mixture of caution and confusion. One had his hand resting on his service weapon. "Sir, step back from that man," the older officer commanded, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. David raised his hands slowly, a gesture of compliance that was second nature. "He kicked in my door," he said, his own voice steady, a stark contrast to the frantic, bubbling gasps coming from Gary on the floor. "He claimed to have an eviction order. My son was terrified. He acted in self-defense." Leo was still. At the end of the hall, the paintball rifle held at a low ready, his knuckles white. David shot him a look, "Stand down," and Leo immediately lowered the marker, leaning it against the wall. Just then, Carol Ann Weatherby pushed past the officers, a silk robe clutched at her throat, her face a mask of theatrical horror. "Oh, my God, Gary, what has he done to you?" She pointed a trembling, manicured finger at David. "Officers, arrest him! This man is violent. He's a menace. He assaulted my nephew, an official agent of the Homeowners Association." The smell of her expensive, cloying perfume mixed with the pepper spray, creating a nauseating cocktail. She was playing her role perfectly, the concerned matriarch, the protector of the community. But David had spent years analyzing human behavior under pressure. He saw the flicker of triumph in her eyes, the momentary flash of satisfaction that her plan, though messy, had resulted in police at his doorstep. She believed she had won. "Ma'am, please stay outside," the younger officer said, gently but firmly guiding her back toward the porch. The older cop knelt beside Gary, who was now moaning about his vision and his sinuses and a possible concussion. An agent of the HOA? Is that a real eviction notice? He asked David, his eyes sweeping the scene, taking in the splintered door, the orange mess, the calm father, and his visibly shaken son. He's not a licensed security guard. And that notice, David said, nodding toward the foreclosure letter, on his entry table, is an illegal document from a corrupt HOA. He had no authority to be here, let alone use force to enter my home. It's all on camera. He gestured toward the small, dark dome of the security camera mounted in the corner of the ceiling. It records audio, too. You'll hear him identify himself as HOA Security and announce an eviction. You'll also hear him slam his body into my bedroom door. The officer's expression shifted. The initial suspicion in his eyes was replaced by a flicker of professional interest. This was no longer a simple assault call. It was messy. It involved property law, impersonation, and a homeowner with the unnerving calm of a man who knew he was in the right. As paramedics loaded Gary onto a gurney, his complaints reaching a theatrical crescendo, the officer took David's statement, his pen scratching methodically across his notepad. David handed over the USB drive with the night's footage. When Carol Ann tried to interject again, the officer held up a hand. "Ma'am, we have his statement. This is now an active investigation." She stared, speechless for the first time since David had met her. The narrative had slipped from her grasp. The flashing lights no longer looked like her victory. They looked like a crime scene she had created. It was a small win, but as the police cars and ambulance finally pulled away, leaving the neighborhood, in an eerie, pre-dawn silence, David knew the real war had just begun. He could still smell the lingering scent of battle in his own home. Carol Ann's counterattack was a classic psyop. Unable to control the police narrative, she went to work. On the Court of Public Opinion, the Northwood Pines Community Facebook page. By sunrise, her post was up. It was a masterpiece of curated hysteria. "A deeply disturbing incident occurred last night," she wrote. "One of our dedicated community patrol officers was viciously assaulted by the resident at 114 Willow Creek Lane while performing his duties. Our thoughts and prayers are with Gary as he recovers from his injuries. We must ask ourselves if this kind of violent element is what we want in our family-friendly community." The comments exploded. Some offered prayers for Gary. Others, loyal sycophants of Carol Ann, demanded action. David became a digital ghost, his name whispered in vitriolic threads. His sanctuary was now just 114 Willow Creek Lane, a locus of fear. If you think HOAs should be held accountable for this kind of slander, type yes so we can get this trending. He was isolated, but not for long. 2 days later, a soft knock came at his door. It was Mildred Gable from 4 houses down. She was a tiny woman in her late 70s, with sharp, intelligent eyes behind thick bifocals. He knew her only by her immaculate rose bushes and the gentle wave she gave him on her morning walks. She clutched a worn leather satchel to her chest. "Mr. Jensen," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I saw Carol Ann's post. It's lies. All of it." She glanced nervously up and down the street. "May I come in?" Inside, the air in her home smelled of lemon polish and old books. Mrs. Gable opened her satchel on his dining room table. It wasn't a purse. It was an archive. She pulled out dozens of manila folders, each neatly labeled with a name and address. Inside were years of violation notices, angry letters, and records of her own battles with Carol Ann. There was a file for the retired couple fined for a non-compliant bird bath, a file for the young family harassed for the color of their children's swing set. It was a meticulous record of petty tyranny, a pattern of abuse stretching back a decade. "She tried to have my husband's memorial bench removed from my garden a few years ago," Mrs. Gable said, her finger tracing the edge of a faded photograph. "Said it wasn't on the approved list of outdoor furniture. I fought her. Like you, I found the loophole. She's never forgiven me for it." She looked at David, her gaze unwavering. Carol Ann's power comes from making people feel alone. I don't think you're alone anymore. That afternoon, David sat with a lawyer, a man named Ben Carter, who specialized in property disputes. Ben was sharp, cynical, and expensive. He reviewed David's evidence, the camera footage, the illegal foreclosure notice, Mrs. Gable's archive. Legally, "You're on solid ground," Ben said, leaning back in his leather chair. The office smelled of paper and ambition. "The break-in, the impersonation, the bad faith foreclosure attempt, it's a slam dunk for a civil suit. But she's going to bury you in criminal court first." He was right. A week later, David was served. The DA's office was pressing charges. Assault with a caustic substance. Carol Ann had leveraged her husband's political capital. The system was now her weapon. Ben explained that even if they won, it would cost a fortune and a year of his life. A conviction, however unlikely, meant he could lose custody of Leo. That was the midpoint. The moment the fake resolution, the police seeing his side, collapsed into a much larger, more dangerous conflict. He felt a cold dread creep up his spine. This was no longer about a garden or a fine. It was about his entire future. He left Ben's office with a choice: play defense and hope to survive, or launch a counteroffensive so devastating it would neutralize the threat entirely. For an intel analyst, there was no choice. You don't win by holding territory. You win by dismantling the enemy's command structure. His target was no longer just Carol Ann. It was the entire corrupt foundation of the Northwood Pines HOA. He and Mrs. Gable became a two-person insurgency. She had the historical data. He had the analytical tools. They spent their evenings poring over the HOA's financial statements, which he'd formally requested as a homeowner. At first, it looked clean, professionally audited, but David knew that the most effective deceptions are hidden in plain sight. He started cross-referencing the vendor payments with state business filings. The landscaping company that received a non-competitive, wildly inflated contract for lawn care? The owner was Carol Ann's brother-in-law. The accounting firm that audited the books? The senior partner played golf with Commissioner Weatherby every Thursday. It was a closed loop of cronyism, funded by the residents' dues. The money wasn't just mismanaged, it was being systematically funneled to her friends and family. But the real discovery came late one night, as David was digging through the county's digital property records, a database as ancient and arcane as a wizard's library. He wasn't looking at his own deed, but at the original plat map for the entire subdivision, filed in 1988. He found the deed for the common lands, the clubhouse, the pool, the walking trails, and attached to it was a covenant, a founding condition, of the development that had been buried for 30 years. The covenant was a fail-safe put in by the original idealistic developer. It stated that the common property was deeded to the HOA on the condition that the board always acted in the collective fiduciary interest of the homeowners. If any board was found to have engaged in willful financial malfeasance, self-dealing, or actions contrary to the financial well-being of the association's members, a petition by just 10% of the homeowners could trigger a clause that would dissolve the board's control over all common property and place it into a homeowner-controlled trust until a new untainted board could be established. It was a tactical nuke. Carol Ann's fraud and nepotism weren't just grounds for a lawsuit. They were the trigger for her complete and total removal from power. He had found her kill switch. What they did next almost made me lose everything, but it also gave me the win of my life. He realized then what Carol Ann's vulnerability was. It wasn't legal action or financial penalties. It was public humiliation. Her entire identity was wrapped up in her status as the Queen of Northwood Pines, the flawless manager of a perfect community. The annual HOA meeting was in 3 weeks. It was her coronation, her yearly address to the subjects. It would be his courtroom. He and Mrs. Gable began to work quietly, strategically. They didn't post on Facebook or send angry emails. They operated in the shadows. They identified other residents from Mrs. Gable's files who had been wronged by Carol Ann. David met them one by one, not in a group, but in living rooms over coffee and on quiet evening walks. He didn't show them all his cards. He simply laid out the financial data for the landscaping contract. He asked them to look at their own HOA dues increase. He armed them not with outrage, but with specific, pointed questions. He was building a grassroots army that didn't even know it was an army. The day before the annual meeting, the trap was sprung, not by him, but by her. Ben Carter called, his voice grim. "They're making an offer, David, a global settlement." The offer was insidious. The DA would drop the assault charges against him. In exchange, he would have to drop any potential civil suit against the HOA, sign a sweeping NDA promising never to discuss the matter publicly, and write a formal apology to Gary for his injuries. "It's a confession, Ben," David said, pacing his small office. "Signing that is admitting I did something wrong." "It's an escape hatch," Ben countered. "You sign it, and this all goes away. No criminal trial, no risk of losing Leo. You can sell your house and move on. If you refuse, Commissioner Weatherby is leaning hard on the DA. They're going to come at you with everything they have." It was a brilliant move. She was offering him a gilded cage. He could save himself, but in doing so, he would validate her power, legitimize her corruption, and leave every other resident of Northwood Pines to her mercy. He would be neutered, his nuke disarmed. Later that day, Ben emailed the official document. David opened the PDF. The formal legal language seemed to mock him. He saw the empty signature box at the bottom, a digital void waiting to swallow his fight. His mouse cursor hovered over it. Every rational part of his brain, the part that cared about safety and self-preservation, screamed at him to click, take the deal, protect your son, get out. But the other part of him, the part that had sat in the dust and heat for his country, the part that had held his wife's hand until the very end, knew that some lines had to be held, no matter the cost. The cursor blinked, a tiny rhythmic heartbeat counting down to a decision that would determine everything. The cursor blinked, a tiny vertical line of light, pulsing with the rhythm of a bomb's timer. Click here to sign. The words were a siren song, promising a quiet harbor in a raging storm. David's hand was steady on the mouse. He saw Leo's face in his mind, the fear in his eyes in the hallway, and the fierce, protective set of his jaw. He saw Sarah kneeling in her garden, her hands covered in rich, dark earth, smiling at him in the afternoon sun. She never backed, down from a fight she believed in. Surrender wasn't in her vocabulary. It couldn't be in his. His gaze drifted to the corner of his screen, to the small, minimized email window. He clicked on it, maximizing the pain. The cursor jumped to the body of a new message. His fingers moved across the keyboard, the clicks sharp and precise in the silent room. The recipient was Ben Carter. The message was 3 words. No. See you. Tomorrow. He hit send. The document with the signature box vanished. The choice was made. He had just kicked over the chessboard and set the pieces on fire. Win or lose, he would do it on his own terms. He felt a profound sense of calm settle over him, the kind that only comes after you've walked past your fear and accepted the consequences. He had a home to defend and a son to raise. The age of appeasement was over. The annual HOA meeting was Carol Ann's coronation. The clubhouse, usually a sterile, empty space, was packed with over 100 residents. The air was thick and stagnant, a mixture of stale coffee, cheap perfume, and palpable tension. David saw neighbors who hadn't spoken to him in weeks, their faces unreadable masks. He found a seat in the back next to Mrs. Gable, who gave his hand a reassuring squeeze. Her knuckles felt like tiny, strong stones. Carol Ann stood at the podium, bathed in the sickly fluorescent light. She was dressed in a crisp, cream-colored pantsuit, a veritable vision of suburban authority. She began her address with a saccharine tribute to community spirit and shared values. She then pivoted, her voice hardening. But our shared values and, more importantly, our shared property values must be protected from elements that seek to undermine our standards. We have had to take firm, decisive action this year against non-compliance, and I want to assure you that this board will never waver in its duty to protect the peace and aesthetic harmony of Northwood Pines. Her eyes swept the room and landed on David for a fraction of a second. It was a declaration of victory. She believed he had been neutralized. She had no idea she was speaking at her own eulogy. Finally, she opened the floor to questions. A nervous silence hung in the air. Then a hand went up in the third row. It was Mr. Henderson, a retired accountant Mrs. Gable had briefed. "Carol Ann," he began, his voice polite but firm. "I was reviewing the annual budget you sent out. I noticed the landscaping contract with Evergreen Solutions increased by 40% this year. Could you explain that massive increase and why the contract was awarded without a competitive bidding process as required by Section 8 of the bylaws?" Carol Ann's smile tightened. "Evergreen does excellent work, Robert. Sometimes quality costs a little more." "They do," he pressed on. "But they're also owned by your brother-in-law, aren't they? Doesn't that represent a conflict of interest?" A murmur went through the crowd. Carol Ann's face flushed a blotchy red. "That is a personal attack and has no place here." Another hand went up. A young mother David had spoken to, the one who had been fined for her children's swing set. "About the new security patrols," she said. "Could you tell us why we're paying $5,000 a month to your nephew, who isn't licensed or bonded by the state, when a professional firm quoted the board $3,000? The murmurs grew louder. Carol Ann gripped the sides of the podium, her knuckles turning white. "Gary is familiar with the community. He has a personal investment." "Does his personal investment include breaking down homeowners' doors in the middle of the night?" The voice was David's. He hadn't stood up. He didn't need to. The words cut through the room like a scalpel. All heads turned. The room fell silent. Carol Ann stared at him, her eyes wide with shock and fury. She had expected him to be cowed, to be silent, awaiting his criminal trial. "You have no right to speak," she hissed, her voice trembling with rage. "You are a violent, unstable individual." "Am I?" David stood up slowly, holding a single sheet of paper. "Then perhaps you can explain this document. It's a foreclosure notice you sent me, threatening to seize my home in 72 hours over illegally manufactured fines. My lawyer tells me this constitutes mail fraud and extortion. I was just wondering which board meeting it was where you voted to approve this. I've checked the public minutes. I can't seem to find it." Her carefully constructed world was collapsing in on her brick by brick. Her power was a house of cards, and he was pulling out the foundation. "This meeting is over," she shrieked, banging a small gavel on the podium. "This is my board. This is my community. The covenants give me the authority." "You're right," David said, his voice dropping to a calm, clear register that carried to every corner of the room. "The covenants are everything." He walked to the front of the room and plugged a USB drive into the projector that Carol Ann had been using for her budget slideshow. An image flashed onto the screen behind her. It was a scanned copy of a dusty 30-year-old document, the original plat deed for Northwood Pines. "Most of you have never seen this," David said, addressing the audience, who were now on the edge of their seats. "This is the founding document of our community. And I'd like to draw your attention to a special covenant, put here by the developer. He worried that one day an HOA board might abuse its power. So he built in a poison pill." David used a laser pointer to highlight a dense paragraph of text. "It says that if any board is found to engage in willful financial malfeasance or self-dealing, a petition by just 10% of the homeowners can immediately suspend the board's authority over all common property and place it into a temporary trust. In other words, if you use our money to enrich your family and friends, you lose everything." The silence in the room was absolute. Carol Ann stared at the screen, her face ashen. She looked like she had seen a ghost. The inflated landscaping. Contract given to your brother-in-law is self-dealing, David continued, his voice resonating with cold, hard certainty. Using our funds to hire your unlicensed nephew is malfeasance. Issuing fraudulent fines to intimidate residents is a breach of your fiduciary duty. You, Carol Ann, are the poison. He placed a thick folder on the table. This is a petition invoking that covenant. It has been signed by 22 homeowners. That's more than double the number required. As of this moment, your board no longer has any legal authority over this clubhouse, our community pool, or a single dollar of our money. It was a gavel slam without a gavel, a perfect, silent coup. The room exploded not into chaos, but into a wave of hushed, excited conversation. Carol Ann stood frozen, a statue of crumbling arrogance. Her empire, built on beige paint and petty rules, had been leveled by a single forgotten paragraph. The aftermath was swift and total. An interim board was elected on the spot, with a reluctant but determined Mrs. Gable as its head. A forensic audit was launched, and within a week, the findings were turned over to the district attorney. Faced with a public scandal and irrefutable evidence of fraud, Commissioner Weatherby cut his wife loose. The assault charges against David were dropped so quietly they barely made a sound. Gary was less fortunate. He pleaded guilty to misdemeanor, breaking and entering, and was ordered to pay for David's door. A month later, David and Leo were in the garden. The late summer sun warmed the back of his neck, and the air was rich with the loamy scent of the earth and the sharp green fragrance. Of tomato leaves, it was the smell of Sarah, the smell of peace. A bright yellow swing set was visible over the fence a few houses down. The sound of children's laughter drifted on the breeze. It was a sound he hadn't heard in months. We almost lost this garden, didn't we? Leo asked, pulling a ripe red tomato from the vine. David looked at the unruly, thriving plants, a living testament to his wife's love. He had not only saved his home, he had saved this small patch of holy ground. He had honored her memory in the one way he knew she would have appreciated, by fighting. Yeah, buddy, he said, his voice thick with emotion. We almost did, but we didn't. He realized the fight was never just about a mailbox or a fine or even his house. It was a fight against the quiet creep of tyranny, the kind that thrives in the shadows of apathy. It's the belief that rules matter more than people, that power is an end in itself. Bullies, whether on the playground or on a homeowners association board, draw their strength from the silence of their victims. The moment one person decides to speak, to fight back with facts and with truth, the entire rotten structure begins to shake. And sometimes, if you push in just the right spot, it comes crashing down for good. Your story could be next. Comment your HOA horror below, and I might cover it. If you believe no one is above the law, hit subscribe so we can take down every corrupt HOA together. Like, share, and tag a friend who needs to hear this. The more people who know their rights, the harder it is for HOAs to get away with this kind of illegal takedown.